George was going in one direction really, and which didn't really include me, and Eric would come and visit me more often, and it became a bit difficult and tense at times, and then he declared his love, and I...
At 82, Pattie Boyd is no longer remembered merely as one of the defining models of the 1960s. She is also the muse behind immortal love songs such as Something Layla and Wonderful Tonight. For more than half a century, the story has usually been told in deceptively simple terms. George Harrison neglected Pattie, while Eric Clapton loved her with such ferocity that he was willing to gamble a friendship to have her. But there is a contradiction that has continued to trouble many observers. George lost Pattie, and their marriage collapsed. Eric ultimately won the woman who had inspired him to write a song heard by millions. Yet their marriage also sank beneath alcoholism, infidelity, and years of unhappiness. Why did two men who loved the same woman arrive at almost the same ending? And could it be that behind those celebrated love songs lies a truth about Pattie Boyd the public has never fully been willing to see? When people look back on Pattie Boyd's story, they are usually drawn toward its brightest scenes. A film set, a member of the Beatles, a legendary guitarist in love with his friend's wife, a song written out of desperation, a marriage that seemed capable of proving that love, if intense enough, would eventually triumph. But strip away the stage lights and begin at the end, and the picture turns cold almost immediately. George Harrison had Pattie when they were both young. He pursued her from the moment they met, married her while the Beatles stood at the summit of global fame, and then slowly allowed distance to grow between them. Eric Clapton followed the opposite path. He loved Pattie for years, waited for her, wrote music for her, and accepted that his friendship with George might be destroyed in the process. One man had her almost from the beginning. The other waited nearly a decade. Neither managed to keep her. For George, the marriage did not end in a single explosive moment. It eroded slowly through absences, long nights, in the studio, spiritual journeys and affairs. When Pattie later described those years, she spoke not only of betrayal, she spoke of the feeling of being abandoned inside her own home. On paper, she was still George Harrison's wife. In private, however, the distance between them had widened until love itself could no longer pull them back in the same direction. Eric appeared to be the opposite. Where George withdrew, Eric moved closer. Where George made Pattie feel forgotten, Eric made her the center of a desire that seemed almost impossible to control. He did not conceal his feelings. He wrote Layla. He waited. He transformed Pattie into the symbol of a forbidden love. So when Pattie and Eric finally married, the public had every reason to believe the story had found its happy ending. But a marriage is not a love song that plays forever. After years of pursuit, Eric sank deeper into alcohol. He was frequently absent from family life. Apologies came, followed by promises to change. Pattie considered leaving more than once, and each time Eric tried to persuade her to stay. For a while, those promises worked. Then everything returned to where it had been. In 1985, Pattie discovered that Eric had fathered a daughter with Yvonne Kelly. It was not merely an affair. It was a concealed truth sitting behind the marriage the public had once celebrated as love's final victory. At this point, the story began to take on a form that was difficult to explain. George had lost Pattie through distance and betrayal. Eric had watched that marriage fall apart and had loved Pattie partly because he believed she deserved to be cherished. Yet once he had her, he gradually created a life in which she felt alone again. Two men, two roads, one ending. No one truly won. And to understand why, we must return to the moment when a confession shook the relationship among the three most famous people in this story. Eric Clapton was not a stranger who wandered into the marriage of Pattie Boyd and George Harrison. He was George's friend. They belonged to the same world, a world in which music, fame, and creative ambition constantly pulled gifted people into one another's orbit. Both were admired guitarists. Both understood the pressure of the stage, the strain of touring, and the sensation of living in an era when every private decision could become public property. That was what gave Eric's feelings for Pattie such extraordinary weight. This was not simply a man in love with a married woman. This was a man in love with his friend's wife. At first, no one assumed the relationship between Eric and Pattie would cross the boundary of friendship. But his feelings became increasingly difficult to hide. After years of loving her from a distance, Eric made a choice most people would have avoided. He told George that he was in love with Pattie. Those words could have destroyed the friendship between two guitar legends. They could also have turned Pattie into the center of a confrontation she had never chosen to create. Eric said them anyway. During that same period, he wrote Layla. The song drew inspiration from his love for Pattie and from the Persian story of Layla and Majnun, a tragic tale of impossible longing. Eric saw himself in the man consumed by love, a man who moved closer to the woman he desired, only to be driven deeper into despair. Layla quickly became one of the most famous songs in rock history. But for the people trapped inside the story, it was not merely music. It was a confession amplified through a guitar, private anguish broadcast to millions, proof that Eric no longer wished or no longer possessed the strength to keep his feelings silent. The public might assume George reacted with fury. A close friend openly declaring love for his wife would seem like an unforgivable betrayal. Yet according to Eric and Pattie, George did not respond that way. He knew how Eric felt, and he believed that in the end, Pattie was the one who had to decide. That composure has sometimes been retold as evidence that all three handled the situation with unusual maturity. Reality was almost certainly more complicated. George may not have staged a public confrontation. That does not mean his friendship with Eric escaped damage. A relationship that had once been close entered the most strained period since the two men had known each other. And between them, Pattie did not immediately choose Eric. She did not leave George the moment she learned Eric loved her. On the contrary, she continued trying to save her marriage for years. That fact alone complicates the familiar image of a woman swept away by a new romance and eager to abandon her husband. George was still her first great love. They shared a history, a home, and years that had once been deeply happy. Even as the distance grew, Pattie could not simply discard everything they had built. Only after the marriage to George had truly collapsed did she move toward Eric. In 1979, Pattie Boyd and Eric Clapton married. To the public, it looked like the perfect ending to a story that had lasted nearly a decade. Eric had finally married the woman for whom he had suffered, waited and written one of the most famous love songs in the world. Love appeared to have defeated friendship time and every obstacle placed in its path. But from that moment on, the story was no longer about a man yearning for a woman. It became a story about life after desire had been fulfilled. And that was where another tragedy began. 2 weeks before her 20th birthday, Pattie Boyd met George Harrison on the set of A Hard Day's Night. Pattie had been cast as a schoolgirl who appeared with George in several scenes. At the time, she was a rising young model. George was already the lead guitarist of the Beatles, a singer and songwriter who would later also become known as a British film producer. They met at precisely the moment when both were entering the most dazzling years of their lives. George quickly pursued Pattie. In 1966, they married. From the outside, it looked almost like a fairy tale written for the age. Pattie Boyd, the model whose beauty seemed to embody swinging London, became the wife of a Beatle. She entered a world almost no one could see from within concerts, recording studios, famous faces, and the kind of celebrity that could change the atmosphere of a room the instant George entered it. In the early years, their marriage carried the belief that each had found someone capable of walking beside the other. But as George's career expanded, the distance between them quietly expanded with it. He became increasingly absorbed in music meditation and his search for spiritual meaning. These were not casual interests. They became the center of George's life, shaping how he worked, how he thought, and how he understood the world. Pattie, meanwhile, began to realize that she was standing outside that journey. Tours pulled George away. The studio consumed his time. Fans were always present. And beyond the glare of fame, there were affairs. Pattie still lived in their home, but the sense of family she had once sought became increasingly fragile. In a 2022 interview with The Independent, Pattie said, "We still loved each other, but we'd gone in different directions." They still loved each other, but they had begun moving toward different lives. It is a calm statement, almost free of accusation. Yet that calmness is precisely what makes it more painful. Their marriage did not end because love vanished overnight. It ended because two people could still care for one another and yet no longer possess the ability to walk the same road. George moved farther from Pattie. Pattie grew lonelier, and inside that widening emptiness, Eric Clapton's presence became more visible. Only after Pattie left George did the public begin to learn more about what had truly happened inside the marriage. Stories of George's affairs emerged. The most shocking involved Maureen Starkey, the wife of Ringo Starr, another member of the Beatles. That revelation altered the way many people viewed Pattie. Until then, she had often been cast as the woman who turned two close friends into rivals. When a love triangle is told through famous names and famous music, it is easy to make the woman at its center responsible for every fracture around her. But the disclosures about George revealed another picture. Pattie was not simply a wife who abandoned her husband for his closest friend. She was also a woman who had lived with loneliness, watched her husband drift farther away, and endured betrayal for years before deciding to leave. What matters is that Pattie did not leave immediately. She stayed, she tried. She continued to believe the marriage might be saved. And to understand why Pattie repeatedly held on to relationships even after they had wounded her, we may need to return to a much earlier time before George, before Eric, and before the bright machinery of swinging London. Pattie Boyd was born in 1944 in Taunton, England, but part of her childhood unfolded in Kenya. Those early years gave her a world of memories radically different from the life she would later encounter. It was a childhood tied to Africa, before changes within her family forced her to learn how to live with loss. At only 8 years old, Pattie was sent to boarding school. For a child, separation from family would have been destabilizing enough. But during one holiday at home, Pattie suddenly learned that her parents had divorced. Almost no one had prepared her for it. The familiar world disappeared without warning. Pattie returned to England with her mother and siblings, entering a new household with a stepfather she never felt close to. From that point on, the feeling that she belonged nowhere began to follow her. At boarding schools in England, Pattie felt different and struggled to fit in. Her memories of Africa gave her little in common with her classmates. She did not try to become the center of attention. She did not respond through rebellion. Instead, she became shy, withdrawn, and accustomed to keeping her emotions to herself. It was a quiet form of self-protection. When a child does not know what may disappear next, hiding emotion can become the only available way to preserve some illusion of control. At 17, Pattie moved to London. She first worked in a beauty salon. Then, her distinctive appearance opened the door to modeling. Almost in an instant, her life changed. The girl who had once felt she belonged nowhere suddenly became one of the defining faces of swinging London. Cameras turned toward her. Magazines noticed her. Pattie's beauty matched an era moving at extraordinary speed, an era in which fashion, music, and youth culture were breaking down old boundaries together. For the first time in her life, Pattie was no longer invisible. The whole world seemed to see her. But being seen is not the same as belonging. Modeling brought Pattie fame and opportunity. Yet, like many young women, she still believed that once a career had been built, the final missing piece was a love powerful enough to remain for life. George appeared and pursued her. Then Eric appeared and loved her with an intensity that seemed impossible to rival. Both gave Pattie the feeling of being chosen. George chose her in a world crowded with women desperate to get close to the Beatles. Eric chose her, even though the price might be his friendship with George and the judgment of the public. Perhaps that is why their love carried such enormous meaning for Pattie. It was not merely romance. It resembled a declaration that at last she had found the place where she belonged. But the feeling of being pursued at the beginning of a relationship does not always survive once marriage begins. And when the early attention fades, an older loneliness can return not loudly, but with a familiarity that is almost terrifying. Years later, Pattie would use one brief sentence to describe that feeling. A sentence that appeared in both marriages. It was not until 2007 when Pattie Boyd published her memoir, Wonderful Today, and later in a series of interviews that she repeatedly returned to one emotion that had followed her throughout her life. I felt lonely again. The sentence did not describe a single moment. It functioned more like a recurring motif resurfacing at different stages beside different men. With George Harrison, Pattie acknowledged that they still loved one another, but that love could not prevent them from moving in opposite directions. The deeper George traveled into music and spirituality, the more Pattie felt herself being left behind. With Eric Clapton, the beginning appeared to be entirely different. Eric had loved her for years. He had been willing to confess to George. He wrote Layla. He waited. He made Pattie the central figure in one of the most famous romantic legends in rock history. Yet after all that pursuit, their marriage was still consumed by distance, alcohol, and betrayal. Pattie was lonely again. This does not mean the two marriages were identical. George and Eric were different men, with different temperaments, choices, and private struggles. But in Pattie's experience, both relationships reached the same point. She no longer felt seen in the way she had at the beginning. Even then, Pattie was never someone who surrendered easily. She tried to save her marriage to George, even after learning of his repeated affairs. She did not immediately run to Eric simply because he pursued her. Pattie remained for years, perhaps, because she still believed the love between her and George had not completely died. With Eric, she repeated that patience. Each time Pattie decided to leave, Eric apologized. He promised to change. He tried to keep her. Pattie forgave him more than once, perhaps, because she continued to hope that the man who had once loved her so fiercely would return to the person she had believed him to be. But after every reconciliation, the old problems returned. That repetition makes Pattie's story more complicated than a simple argument over who was right and who was wrong. Perhaps Pattie Boyd never intended to hurt George Harrison or Eric Clapton, but perhaps what she had always been searching for was not one particular man. Perhaps it was the feeling of being pursued, desired, and loved without reservation. George had given her that feeling from their first meeting on the set of A Hard Day's Night. In a world where millions of fans looked toward the Beatles, George directed his attention toward Pattie. Eric gave her the same feeling in an even more extreme form. He risked a friendship. He wrote Layla. He waited for Pattie for years. Eric's love was not discreet. It rang through guitars, performances, and a song that became immortal. But a person can be desired with overwhelming intensity and still be lonely inside a marriage. That may be the deepest contradiction in this entire story. George and Eric both once made Pattie feel like the only woman in the world. Yet once shared life began, both men were gradually pulled into their own desires, problems, and choices. Of course, none of these interpretations has ever been proven. There is no evidence that Pattie consciously sought pursuit as an appetite that could never be satisfied. Nor can her childhood or her loneliness be used to lessen George's or Eric's responsibility for their affairs. George made George's choices. Eric made Eric's choices. But if Pattie truly felt lonely in both marriages, then the story is clearly more complicated than identifying one guilty person. Perhaps Pattie did not repeatedly choose the wrong man. Perhaps she repeatedly believed that an intense love at the beginning would protect her from the ancient fear of being left behind. But pursuit is not companionship. Desire is not commitment. And no love song, however beautiful, can substitute for presence in ordinary life. Whether the man beside Pattie was George Harrison or Eric Clapton, the ending returned her to an emotion she had known from childhood: loneliness. In the end, no one truly won, and no one can claim to know the whole truth behind the wreckage. George Harrison continued his musical career and built a life with Olivia Harrison. He left behind a legacy as one of the Beatles' greatest musicians, not only through his years with the band, but through the creative journey that followed. In 2001, George died after battling cancer. But his music remained. Songs shaped by love, spirituality, and the turmoil of his private life continued to inspire generations. In public memory, George remains a complicated artist, a man capable of writing melodies of extraordinary delicacy, yet also capable of inflicting deep wounds within his first marriage. Eric Clapton also had to travel a long road. After years of struggling with alcoholism and personal tragedy, he gradually stabilized his life. Eric maintained his sobriety and founded the Crossroads Center in Antigua, a treatment facility for people fighting addiction. Music remained part of his life. Although peripheral neuropathy has made guitar playing more difficult in recent years, Eric has continued to release albums and tour when his health allows. He is still regarded as one of the most influential guitarists in rock history. But that reputation cannot erase what happened in his marriage to Pattie. The man who once wrote Layla because he could not have her ultimately became the man she had to leave. As for Pattie Boyd, her life gradually moved away from the noise that had once surrounded her name. In 2015, Pattie married Rod Weston, a property developer. She chose a quieter existence far from the romances the media had turned into mythology. It may not be a spectacular ending, but after decades of being defined through famous men, quiet may have been exactly what Pattie needed most. More than half a century has passed, yet the story of George Harrison, Eric Clapton, and Pattie Boyd remains one of the most famous love triangles in music history. It survives not only because of the names involved, and not only because of Something Layla or Wonderful Tonight. It survives because it contains a contradiction many people recognize in their own lives. A love can begin with extraordinary intensity and still end in silence, distance, and the feeling of no longer being seen. George once loved Pattie. Eric once loved Pattie too. Perhaps both men were sincere at certain moments. But love is not measured only by the force of its beginning. It is also measured by how a person remains when infatuation has faded, when life becomes ordinary, and when the person beside them is no longer a distant dream. George failed to do that. In the end, Eric failed as well. And Pattie for many years continued trying to preserve marriages she had believed would finally give her a true home. Looking back at the entire story, it is difficult to say that anyone was entirely right or entirely wrong. George became distant and betrayed Pattie. Eric once loved her with overwhelming intensity, yet later repeated the same absence and betrayal. Pattie left George for Eric, but she did not do so impulsively. She waited, struggled, and forgave repeatedly in both marriages. Each person entered the story searching for something different. George searched for music and spiritual meaning. Eric searched for the woman he believed could rescue him from despair. Pattie searched for a love durable enough to keep her from feeling abandoned. No one received exactly what they wanted. Perhaps there will never be a single answer to this story. Every observer sees a different cause, And that is precisely why, more than half a century later, the relationship among George Harrison, Eric Clapton, and Pattie Boyd is still remembered as one of the most famous tragedies in rock history. Was Pattie Boyd truly the muse betrayed by two legends? Or was she a woman who spent her life searching for a feeling of love that no man could sustain forever?